If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Toy Story so that we can study beginnings and endings. This 1995 film was directed by John Lasseter and written by Joss Whedon, Andrew Stanton, Joel Cohen, and Alec Sokolow. From an original story by John Lasseter, Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, and Joe Ranft. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd love it if you could give us a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. Now, Valerie, what did you have for the genres for Toy Story?
I think the global genre is worldview, and I think that Woody is the primary protagonist. And the secondary genre I'm calling action. What do you have?
Oh, so I've got the same genres, but I've mixed them around. So I've got the global genre as action and then the secondary genre as worldview maturation. But I do agree, and I agree with you. I think Woody is the protagonist in this story as well.
So this is really interesting. With Toy Story, I think even though Melanie and I are identifying the same 2 genres, but we're kind of saying we're reversing them a bit. You know what, Melanie, if we did a deep dive into Toy Story, it is so well written that I bet you we would find that both genres, action and worldview, are fully present. That would not surprise me at all.
Absolutely. No, and I'm with you. Like, again, I think this is a masterwork of storytelling. And, you know, we could spend weeks and attack it from many different angles and find a lot of things about genres in there that we just couldn't cover off in having to pick 2.
Okay, so we're both right. That's what we're going to say this week about genre.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Okay, so for anyone who spends any time studying story theory, you start to notice that there are a couple of movies and books that keep getting used as examples. Now, Chinatown is a prime example. It's a really good film, but it gets hauled out so often that I don't know about anybody else, but I am so tired of hearing about Chinatown. Aaron Sorkin films, Tolkien's books, and Gone Girl are frequent examples as well that get pulled out. And you know what? So is Toy Story. I'm not sick of Toy Story, however. But it is why I chose it this week for the show. Now, the downside to having a limited number of stories used in reference books is that we can get sick of them. Like, I'm sick of Chinatown. I'm starting to get sick of Tolkien, so I'm avoiding all that for now because I do not want to get sick of that. The upside, though, is that as writers, we have a short list of go-to stories that we can consult for just about any storytelling principle. And that's a really big time saver for us. So this season, I am focusing on beginnings and endings. But, you know, like Melanie said, we could use Toy Story to talk about any number of storytelling principles. Pixar really does know what they're doing. There are a couple of books out there, actually, if anyone is interested, about the Pixar approach to creativity and storytelling. And I've read the following 3, and I do recommend all of them. The first is Creativity, Inc., and that's by Ed Catmull. The second is The Best Story Wins by Matthew Lunn. That's how to apply storytelling to marketing, actually. And the third one is Pixar Storytelling, Rules for Effective Storytelling Based on Pixar's Greatest Films. And that's by Dean Movshevitz. Alrighty, so let's look at the step in, step out. As Stephen Pressfield has explained, the opening scene and the closing scene of a story go together as a unit. Sometimes there's a repetition of a scene, other times there's a repetition of an idea or a theme. Now, we've also learned this season from John York that it's not only the opening and closing scenes that go together. It's the entire first act and the entire last act. And we talked a lot about this last week in the Water Horse episode. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I do recommend that you go back to it. So this whole idea of the first act and the last act going together, this is what I'm referring to as stepping into a story and stepping out of a story. So how does this apply to Toy Story? The beginning hook is 21 minutes and the ending payoff is about 15 minutes. The story opens with a title sequence, and this is a masterful piece of storytelling. While the credits are rolling, the song You've Got a Friend in Me is playing, and this is actually repeated in the ending payoff. So last week we talked about a framing story, and we had Old Angus and then Young Angus in the story, and the framing story was Old Angus on either end of the story, at the beginning and the end. Here, the song You've Got a Friend in Me is kind of framing the story. It's not a framing story, but it's a technique to contain the whole narrative. So what is happening here in this title sequence? Well, it's a whole lot of world building. That's what's happening. We meet Woody. Slinky's loyalty is established. The romance between Woody and Bo Peep is established. We learn that it's moving day in 1 week. And this introduces a ticking clock to the narrative, which immediately amps up the progressive complications, the stakes, and the narrative drive. So well done. And we meet the main cast of Andy's Toys, and we get to know their personalities. For example, we know that Mr. Potato Head wants a Mrs. Potato Head. So then the first full scene is, after the title sequence, is Andy's birthday party. So gifts mean new toys, and the old toys are so worried that Woody deploys the toy soldiers on a recon mission. Now, what's important here is that the rule about toys not revealing themselves to humans is established in the scene. When all the party kids come running into Andy's room and they have to get back to their positions really quickly, that's an important setup for the ending payoff. Also in the beginning hook, we see that Andy's toys are impressed with Buzz and they give him all their attention. Woody feels rejected by them. So the toys were a whole unit as a family of toys, and now they're divided. And finally, in the beginning hook, we see that Andy also prefers Buzz and Woody gets relegated to the toy box. Now, the ending payoff is primarily an action sequence. Woody hatches a plan to save Buzz and enlists the help of Sid's rejected toys. So those toys are rejected just like he was rejected at the end of the beginning hook. But in order to save Buzz, they have to break the toy rule that was also set up in the beginning hook. They actually expose themselves to reveal themselves to humans, to Sid in particular. Then in the ending payoff, we have Andy's toys not understanding that Woody is trying to help Buzz, but then they do get it and they help with the rescue. So now the toys that were divided are a whole family again. Then we have Buzz falling with style. So this also came up in the beginning hook. Here, Woody is acknowledging that Buzz is flying, and that's his way of helping a friend be who he wants to be. But Buzz says he's falling with style, which is his way of acknowledging that, yes, he knows he's a toy, and now he's okay with it. Then they're reunited with Andy, and they were separated from Andy at the beginning of the middle build. And then we have Christmas morning. So again, we have gifts meeting new toys. The old toys are worried. The toy soldiers are deployed again. But this time, Buzz is particularly concerned. Now, Woody, who's been through all of this, teases him. He's like, "Oh, you're not worried, are you?" And of course, we see Mr. Potato Head getting his Mrs. Potato Head. And we see that Woody and Bo Peep are reunited and the romance is still alive. Now, if we refine this then, because I just gave a whole lot of details, if we refine this into its sort of highest level, simplest form, we get something that looks like this. In the beginning hook, we have Andy's party and Woody's stature is upended by Buzz, the new toy. Then we have Andy's toys rejecting Woody, and then Andy rejects Woody. In the ending payoff, we have Andy's toys welcoming Woody back, and then Andy welcomes Woody back. And then we have Christmas morning, where Buzz fears his world will be upended by a new toy, and Woody comforts him. All right, Melanie, what do you think of this so far?
Well, I think it's hard, isn't it, to break this down into smaller steps at the beginning and the ending, because there is so much in the story and the way it's set up. So I think you've done a good job considering how much information and world building there is in the beginning, and then how much is actually paid off and reflected back in that final ending payoff. So, and it's good to simplify it and draw out those main pieces. But I like what you did with the detail, and I think this is a kind of movie where you could go down and itemize all the detail and then see how that is either reflected back, or it's echoed, or it is rhymed in the final part of the story. So I think you've done a good job, because there's a lot in there.
There is a lot, but there's a lot in there, but it all needs to be in there. There's nothing extra. Every bit of dialogue, every movement of the characters, all are important pieces of the storytelling. And that's the type of writing and the type of story that I really like, the lean kinds where there's nothing extra, there's no unnecessary description or monologues that are unimportant. I like everything in a story to need to be in that story. Okay. So I feel like I'm starting to repeat myself when it comes to beginnings and endings. This is the joy of taking 10 episodes to talk about one concept, because there is so much to learn about a concept. But since I have talked a lot about beginnings and endings already this season, and because Toy Story is such a rich story for us to talk about, I wanted to kind of take a little detour and point out some of the other things that this film does really well. The first of them is exposition. Now, I'm sure you've heard that as writers, we're supposed to show, don't tell. Well, this is not true. What we do is show and tell. The show means to convey information in a working scene. The tell means using exposition to move a story forward. The problem most writers run into is that they tell the whole story and they end up with 100,000 words and few, if any, working scenes. That is a problem. But we will also have a problem if we try to show everything and never tell anything. If we're dramatizing everything, then our story will go off track. It'll wander and the pace will slow right down. Not everything needs to be dramatized. So then how do you deal with exposition so it's not a big information dump? Well, that's a fair question. There are proven ways of using exposition, and when we know them, we can make effective storytelling decisions. In the beginning hook of Toy Story, there is a whole lot of exposition. It's crammed with exposition, but you don't notice it until you sit down to actively analyze the story. That's how masterful it is. How many times have we watched Toy Story over the years? So what they're doing is taking all of this exposition and giving it to the viewer in a very short period of time through dialogue. So if you're curious about how to do exposition, study the beginning hook of Toy Story, and then maybe compare it to how Aaron Sorkin handles exposition. And we went into a lot of detail about this in our episode on A Few Good Men. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, I recommend that you check that one out. Melanie, did you have any thoughts about exposition?
I did. I think what they did as well in Toy Story at the beginning is they set up a scenario where it was all right to have the exposition. Do you know? So that's that beginning. You're introduced to the characters and their world, but it's doing triple things at the same time. So you're seeing the parties coming. You see Woody take the microphone, and he's being set up as the kind of leader of the toys, and he's then doing what a leader should do and preparing his people for the change that's coming. And so that scenario that they've created for Woody allows, I think, the exposition to take place in a way that is natural and fits in with the rest of the storytelling. So I think that, like you said, there's a lot to learn about the situation as well of where the exposition and how that takes place.
Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was multiple protagonists, because I don't know about you, Melanie, but this is a question I get a lot. How do you write a story with two or more protagonists? And if you are in that situation and you're writing your novel and there's more than one protagonist, honestly, study Toy Story. I don't care what genre you're writing in, it doesn't matter. What you want to look at is how did they manage to balance the stories of each of the characters. Now, I said off the top that I think Woody is the primary protagonist, and I stand by that because everything in a story has a hierarchy. So if you have multiple protagonists, they're not all equal. One of them is the primary, and then the secondary and the tertiary, and on and on. So Toy Story has two protagonists, Woody, the primary, and Buzz, the secondary. And I did a training with Alex Sokolov recently, and he actually talked about their approach to this dual protagonist story. And what he said was they prioritized them, which is putting everything in a hierarchy, right? And he even said that Woody is the main protagonist. And then what they did, they sat around and they talked about the two characters, and they made sure that they told complete stories for each of the two protagonists. For Woody and for Buzz, they both have fully developed character arcs. So, dual protagonist stories absolutely can be done, but it does increase the degree of writing difficulty because you're now writing two complete stories within a book instead of one complete story in a book. What they did to make this dual protagonist story work even better is that even though there's two protagonists, the storyline is linear and the two protagonists are going through the adventure together. So they're not parallel stories that are happening. The two guys are in this together and they're working through it. So it's one storyline with two protagonists. Dual protagonists with dual storylines is another degree of writing difficulty again, because you're writing two whole books. You really are. And in those situations, I tend to think of those books as dueling protagonists and dueling storylines, because it's the kind of structure that sets up the two storylines to compete for the reader's attention. Lots of writers try to use this, and they do it because they honestly don't know how difficult it is to execute. That's fair enough. We all start somewhere. We all gotta have our bumps and bruises and scrapes as we figure this whole thing out. So my best recommendation is for anyone who is writing what I call dueling storylines, where you have actual multiple storylines, is to make sure that your narrative drive is super strong so that your reader doesn't mind being pulled away from one storyline to the next. And the storylines have to be connected in some way. The reader has to see how one is playing off the other. All right. The next thing I wanted to talk about was progressive complications and escalating stakes. This is a topic that seems to keep getting lost in the shuffle of story theory, and I don't know why. It does concern me, I have to say, because without progressive complications and escalating stakes, a story doesn't work. Who wants to read that book? Not me. What's more important here is that progressive complications and escalating stakes are a key factor in creating narrative drive. A great exercise for anyone who wants to learn more about this, a great exercise is to map the progression of escalating stakes in Toy Story and notice the chain reaction of events. It is phenomenal. And we kind of touched on this a little bit in Guardians of the Galaxy and the Water Horse as well, where one thing just connects to the next, connects to the next, connects to the next. It's not simply, when we're talking about progressive complications and escalating stakes, it's not simply a list of plot points. So it's not this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's a series of cause and effect statements. Quite often, I hear writers say things like, I want to write a page turner, or I want my characters to have a strong arc, or I want to sell a lot of books. All great goals. But what I don't hear is people saying, I want to learn how to escalate the stakes of my story. And you know what? Without escalating stakes, which come because of the progressive complications, none of those other things happen. All you end up with is a flat, boring story. So next season, season 4, I'm studying middles, but I don't know. After that, for season 5, I might tackle progressive complications and escalating stakes. We'll see. If this is something that interests you and you would like me to tackle it for season 5, let me know on Twitter or Instagram at Valerie_Francis. Melanie, how did you get on with your study this week?
Well, this is very interesting for me this week because, like you said, Toy Story is used as an example of what to do quite a lot. And in the book that one of the books that I've been referring to in my study this season, which is Screenwriting the Sequence Approach by Paul Joseph Galino, he uses this is the first example that he gives, which I did not know until I saw the book. So we'd picked the movies before I actually saw the book and Toy Story and how it was broken down. So that sounds great because, hey, the answers are kind of already there for me. I didn't want to regurgitate only what Galino says. So I was trying to find a way to pitch this week and show what I learned by not referring a little bit, but also putting my own analysis and spin on it. So we'll see how this goes. So again, I have identified the single central action, and I've used what Galino has identified because I just thought that was a good idea to show you how someone who does this far more frequently than I do has broken it down into sequences. But what I did this week was actually look at the dramatic question of the story and then the dramatic question for each sequence. So, which is something that Valerie referred to last week when we were doing the water horse. And just by coincidence, it's something that I had a look at this week for Toy Story. And I think there's further study to be done here. And I think we could probably look at the way these questions are patterned throughout a story. But this is a first cut for me, first example. But I found some interesting things that I'll share with you. So first of all, I'll just go through and identify the single central actions. So in sequence 1, we have the unwanted present. In sequence 2, we've got falling with style. In sequence 3, Buzz takes a hit. Sequence 4 is double prizes at Pizza Planet. Sequence 5 is falling without style. Sequence 6 is called the big one. And sequence 7 is the toys are alive. And then sequence 8 is the finale that soars. So it's interesting in considering that Woody is the protagonist. Quite a lot of that action in each of the sequences centers around Buzz in the way that Galino has described it or used his single central action descriptors. And I thought that was interesting. And like I mentioned, Galino uses Toy Story as a perfect example of the 3-act, 8-sequence framework. But what I find interesting about his analysis is the point that he makes about each sequence. So overall, Woody is the protagonist in each sequence. He is the one that is challenged by Buzz's arrival at the end of sequence 1 and who continues to deal with the situation he creates, first for himself and then for him and Buzz. And each sequence, except for the first and the final one, end badly for Woody. So that links back to what Valerie was saying about progressive complications. And it's interesting to note that all of those, so sequence 2 to sequence 7, really end badly for Woody, and that is mainly driven by the complications and the arc that Woody has to go on. Now, the dramatic question that drives 6 out of the 8 sequences is, will Woody regain his spot as Andy's favourite toy? However, like I mentioned, each sequence has its own dramatic question that drives the action. So here are the dramatic questions for each of the sequences. So the first one is, will Woody succeed in calming the toys down? So this question sets up the story's dramatic question, even if it isn't related to the main source of tension in the film. We see the toy's greatest fears, which is being replaced by a new toy. And will Woody succeed in calming them down is related to the main tension of the film, but it contains the motivation behind Woody's future actions. So Woody's explanation to the toys is at this moment is that it's what Andy wants, and that is the most important thing. It's not what they want as toys. And that is actually very important to Woody's story arc. Now, Woody's wants and needs are established in the first sequence, and we also see Woody at his peak. He's Andy's favourite toy, and he's the leader of the rest of the toys. So the dramatic question for this sequence is answered positively for Woody and the toys because we don't see Buzz's arrival until the first part of the second sequence. In sequence 2, we are presented with the story's dramatic question, which is, will Woody regain his spot as Andy's favourite toy? The dramatic question can be posed at this point because we know who the protagonist is, so it's Woody. We know that what he wants, which is to be the favourite toy again, and we know who the antagonist is, and that's Buzz. So we also see how Woody's jealousy impacts his standing with the rest of Andy's toys. Now, in sequence 3, as I've mentioned before, it usually reinforces the problem or the main tension of the film. So the dramatic question of will Woody regain his spot as Andy's favourite toy drives this sequence. And what we see is the protagonist trying to resolve the problem as quickly as possible to get back to the way things used to be. But Woody's attempts to defeat Buzz and re-establish himself as the top toy works, but his attempts turn the toys against him and then also towards Buzz. So the point of this dramatic question here in sequence 3, and it's something that Alexandra Sokolov says in her book, is that we usually see a doubling down of the story theme or the story question in sequence 3. Now, I can see this play out in the Toy Story, but I haven't looked at this for any other stories. So it's an interesting first proof of that concept. Now, in sequence 4, the dramatic question for this sequence changes to, will Woody be able to get Buzz back home? But Woody's larger dramatic question about re-establishing himself as the top toy remains. So the obstacle for this sequence is Buzz, because he discovers Woody was the one who knocked him out the window, which led to the point of them both falling out. Buzz doesn't trust Woody, and really who can blame him? The tension is escalated significantly because Woody and Buzz, so the protagonist and antagonist, are in the same situation and they have to work together. They can't, and the answer to this scene's or sequence's question is Woody does not get Buzz back home. Sequence 5's dramatic question is far more specific than the previous one because Woody and Buzz are in an even more precarious situation. They are trapped at Sid's. And as we've seen, Sid is the Frankenstein of the toy world. The question becomes, can Woody get himself and Buzz out of Sid's house? The larger question remains the same, and the answer for this sequence is no, Woody doesn't succeed. But what stops Woody is the physical obstacles at Sid's house, such as the locks, the other toys, and Scud the dog. At this stage, Woody and Buzz seem to be on the same page because they both want to escape from Sid's. In sequence 6, the obstacle changes and the dramatic question changes to, can Woody overcome Buzz's lack of cooperation in order to escape from Sid's house with him? Now, Buzz's realization that he's a toy and not really a space ranger changes him from action-focused to despondent and immovable. Buzz's depression leads to Woody resolving the dramatic question for the film. So this happens in sequence 6, which is really interesting. So will Woody regain his spot as Andy's favourite toy is resolved in this sequence because Woody stops trying to achieve the goal. And at Woody's moment of greatest extremity, when all appears lost, he goes through his own crushing disillusionment and realises that he cannot make Andy love him and that his efforts to do so do not move him closer to what he wants. And so in this moment of despair as well, that now Buzz starts to rally and lift for Woody. In sequence 7, with the shift in Woody and Buzz complete, we start to see positive answers to the dramatic questions for this sequence, which is, will Woody be able to rescue Buzz before he's blown up by Sid? However, with the dramatic question for the story answered, we do need a new question for the ending payoff of the movie. Now, I think the question becomes, do Buzz and Woody get to Andy before he moves house? And I think this question is set up at the beginning of the 7th sequence and stretches over the 2 final sequences. So the complication of Buzz being strapped to the rocket needs to be resolved first. And then finally, in sequence 8, which is the last one, the question about returning to Andy is answered positively, and also is the original question. And we do see Woody restored to his position as the favoured toy, but he occupies this top spot with Buzz. Now, what I find interesting is how the dramatic question in Toy Story changes for some sequences. It's worth looking to see if there's a pattern, like I mentioned, in this type of dramatic question in a story. So, for example, the dramatic question isn't raised until the 2nd sequence. It's reinforced in the 3rd sequence. The question in sequences 3, 4, 5, and 6 are variation of will Woody get Buzz back home or away from Sid's. And then the variations are linked to the obstacle Woody faces in each sequence as well. Well, that's the pattern that I've noticed in Toy Story. So the central dramatic question is asked in the 2nd sequence and it's resolved in the 6th sequence. It's not surprising that the dramatic question isn't formed until the destabilising element or the inciting incident reveals itself to the protagonist. It is the resolution then of the question in the 6th sequence that surprised me. By Woody understanding he can't force Andy's love, it opens up the resolution at the end of the story where Woody and Buzz can share the top spot. So, Valerie, did you have anything to add or any comments about that?
I think this is really cool. And I think this is, you said it warranted further study, and I agree with you, because I think this is a way of really deepening our understanding of what all the parts of a story do. And I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but the beginning hook is, usually fairly easy by relative terms, because the beginning hook is what we spend all the time thinking about and writing and so forth. And then that middle build starts and it's like hitting a brick wall. Well, now what do you do? So they're in the extraordinary world. Like, where do I go from here? So one of the things about writing a novel is that it's a big, big long-term project and it can really feel overwhelming. Well, if we can take this big, massive story and break it down into more manageable pieces, so 3-act structure or 4-act structure or 8 sequences, and we have a good understanding as to what each of these sequences does and how it works, and that it's answering a specific question within the story as a whole, then now instead of having to write a whole novel, we just have to write a sequence. And that's a lot less overwhelming, a lot less daunting. And we talked about, I think it was last week, about a subplot taking over or, a secondary character taking over. Well, if we have a handle on how sequences work and what they're supposed to be doing, and that each of them is posing a question that needs to be answered. And these questions have to do with the main story and the central dramatic question and all that kind of stuff. If we understand that, it's kind of like a decision tree, right? Like you have one question then that breaks out into multiple other questions. You have a roadmap. It's not a formula because there's tons of flexibility, but it gives you waypoints as you navigate your way through a novel. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I wish that I stumbled on this a bit earlier in terms of seeing what those questions are, those narrative questions are for each of the sequences. But anyway, better late than never, I think. So what action step do you have for everyone this week?
Actually, this week I would like everyone to focus on the exposition in the beginning hooks of their stories, because exposition is a storytelling principle. And the storytelling principles are neutral. They're not good or bad. We just have to know what they are, how they function, what they do well, what they don't do so well. So stories, generally speaking, tend to be much heavier on the exposition in the very beginning, because the writer, whether it's a movie or a novel or a TV show, they're just trying to orient the audience to the world, introduce the world, do a little world building, introduce the protagonists and the wants and the needs, all that kind of stuff. So my action step for you this week is really take a look at that exposition in your beginning hook. Do you have any? Were you afraid to use it? Did you have that show don't tell looming in your mind and you were frightened to death to put any exposition in? If so, take a look at some of the books you're reading and see that there's exposition in there. See how they're using it. Ask yourself, had you noticed it before when you were just reading the book as a reader? I think when we read actively and we see how exposition is being used, it's going to make a huge difference to our writing.
Well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Lost in Translation. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And you can now find her on TikTok at Valerie Francis Author. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook and Twitter at Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.